When you go to Google, the one-stop shop for your backyard academic trying to win a fight on the internet, and type define journalism, you get the card response. The activity or profession of writing for newspapers, magazines, or news websites, or preparing news to be broadcast. This definition has no doubt been rolled around you in some discussion of what a journalist is, and therefore what a games journalist is, and it's useful, handleable, and also just pretty much wrong. Defining journalism in this way is true, but also in a way that fails to account for what journalism is. It's a bit like defining a vaccinologist as a person who hands you a lollipop and calls you brave. True, but a bit focused on the final moments of an experience. To get into the discussion of what games journalism is, we're first going to need to work on our definition of what journalism is, and from inside the sources where people are trained to do the journalism, there's a quiet panic going on about what that even means. Now, we're simplifying a lot of things to fit this under 10 minutes, so we'll just fly past the idea that all language is contextual and words don't have meanings, they have usages, and jump straight to, there are 3 things that journalism means. First, there is journalism, the cultural concept. It's a bit like pornography, in that we don't know what it means exactly, but we're sure we know it when we see it. This is great, because it means that people can complain about thing isn't journalism, and they demand people do things like just report the news. This is a really simplistic way to view journalism, but it's sort of what most people mean. They have this vision of journalism, real journalism, as this thing that is done by plucky reporters with hats and tickets in them, and wonder why making a news program is so complicated. This cultural concept is one of the scariest things to deal with right now as a journalism student, but we'll get to that later. Second, there's journalism, the industry. Now, I don't have a lot of love for this entity, but I have some sympathy for it, as one might for someone who is terminally ill. Journalism, the industry, is a multinational entity with distribution networks and graphic design patterns and style guides and editorial oversight and investors and bosses and ideologies, and mostly it's funded by pixie dust. This is an institution that's mostly been funded by people giving them money for what they do, and advertisers giving them money, a twofold model that's fraught with all sorts of ethical concerns, which might stop being an issue as it collapses. Pay for your local paper, people. Games journalism, the industry, is a bit of a rough shape because there just isn't that much money to support it, which is weird because there's also an enormous demand for it. Third, then, and the thing I'm quite hung up on, is journalism the process. The way I explained it in my essay that did quite well, thank you, was that journalism is the practice of turning data into facts, into narrative, into a story. Journalism is the process of turning information into a meaningful narrative that a reader can process. Journalism is deciding what information is useful to a story and what is not. Now, journalism, the industry, already knows this. It doesn't want to admit it, but you know who's writing press releases and those first impression guides and doing presser interviews to explain to journalists the things they need to know about the story? It's other journalists. It was one of the pieces of advice we got in class. If you want a job in journalism, be prepared to write press releases to send to journalists. This makes some morbid sense, really. If you're a journalist and something that looks like you wrote it lands on your desk, it does make your job easier. There's the thing that has journalism, the industry, kind of scared. Because to the perspective of a lot of people, the actual task of journalism is easy. They think you just stick a camera in front of something and that's it. Boom, there's your journalism. Except what you don't mention and what you do mention, how you talk about these things, what you choose to say, and why they're all part of this. Journalism, the skill, is hard. Journalism, the industry, is in trouble. And journalism, the cultural entity, isn't really understood. It doesn't seem, when you describe journalism, people wonder about things like ethical frameworks and style guides and leveraging popular positions. They mostly talk about it in terms of recording a thing that happened. So why then aren't there games journalists? Well, that's a hyperbolic statement designed to hook you into the narrative. And, clickbait. Well, yeah. Part of the job of a journalist is to put information in a meaningful context, and part of that meaningful context is something you're going to bother to click on. It is literally their job to encourage you to engage with the work. When I talk about doing journalism, I'm talking about a process and a tool. It's taking information as you've gleaned it and putting it into a useful context. Let's Plays are a form of games journalism, documenting and recording an example of a play of a game. Critical analysis of a work, that's games journalism too. Games reviews are games journalism too, I guess, if they have to. But that's a complaint for another time. The work of shows like How It's Played and The Rules Girl, however, are also games journalism. They're putting data into a useful, meaningful context. So too, however, is the work of Campster or Innuendo Studios. a channel that stated it's mostly using games to talk about everything, and then later everything to talk about everything. Thank you for muddying the brand. Games journalism isn't an entity, it's a process, and it's something a lot of people are doing. We should be interested in what they are doing with it, and what that says about us when we choose to engage with it. Are people treating games journalism as an avenue to tell stories about humanity, about creativity, about expression and fun and care and community and things that I like? Or are they using it to get defensive about how things are and should always be? Journalism is a process of telling stories about things that are true. So we should be very careful and consider what those stories are saying.